A lot of people are predicting at the moment that China's economy is about to collapse. This is something I talked about in a recent video here. But the fact is, Western analysts get China wrong all the time. In this video, I'll give you some examples from history which illustrate why we should be a bit skeptical about the claims which are being made now. Chinese policymakers clearly are facing very difficult challenges at the moment. I've talked about these issues already in some other videos on this channel. The point I'm making here is that Western analysts are not always very good at predicting how things are likely to turn out in China. And they're also not always the best at telling Chinese policymakers what they should do. Here's my first example. When the Communist Party took power in China in 1949, they were facing very serious economic problems then as well, although of a very different kind from today. They were facing very serious inflation after years of warfare and turmoil. They'd been involved in a long civil war with their rivals, the Nationalist Party, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. And up until 1945, they'd also been at war with the Japanese, who had been occupying parts of China. All of this warfare had caused inflation throughout the 1940s. This was largely because of the poor supply of basic necessities. The economist Isabella talks about this in her book. She says that transport networks were in complete disarray, so goods couldn't get through to where they were needed. Agricultural production was badly impacted because many working the land switched to producing just for their own needs rather than producing stuff to sell. And businessmen were making everything worse by hoarding and speculating in commodities to make a quick buck out of the general chaos. The nationalists then tried to finance their war effort by printing more money, and that sent inflation completely through the roof. American intelligence agents, watching all this from across the Pacific, came to the conclusion that even if the communists did win in the Civil War, they probably wouldn't be able to sort all this out, at least not without their help. A CIA briefing from 1948 said this. Hitherto, the Chinese communists have been spared the problems of administering a national government, the maintenance of political order on a nationwide scale, and the management of a national economy. Their competence to deal with the larger problems which Chiang Kai-shek has failed to solve remains unproved. For all their anti-imperialism, the communists would find it extremely difficult to cope with the pressing economic problems of China in a state of isolation from the Western powers. But the fact is, they did manage to sort it out. In the first few months of the new government, they managed to get prices under control, which in the circumstances was pretty impressive. This is likely a major reason why the new Communist Party regime was able to win over so much support at the beginning. If you want to know the details of how they did it, maybe I'll make another video on this sometime in the future. The point I really want to make here is that analysts over in the US had assumed that they couldn't do it, and they got it wrong. Here's my second example. Quite a lot of economists are saying at the moment that for China now to successfully solve its economic problems, it will need to undergo some major restructuring to shift from an economy reliant on investment and debt to one which is more driven by consumption. But this restructuring is likely to be very difficult because it will involve powerful groups which are currently benefiting from the existing system losing out. The economists Klein and Pettis, which I've talked about before on this channel, have actually gone as far as to say that this restructuring will require reforms at least as dramatic and politically difficult as the reforms implemented by Deng Xiaoping beginning in 1978. Those reforms after 1978 were indeed dramatic and required shifting from a centrally planned economy over to a market economy. The political scientist Susan Shirk wrote a really important book on how they did this. She made clear that this was an extremely complex and difficult task. Most of the previous attempts at economic reform, specifically those in the Soviet Union in 1957 and 1965, Poland in 1956, Yugoslavia in 1952 and 1965, Hungary in 1968, Romania in 1967, and Czechoslovakia in 1968 failed, leading to no structural changes in the economy. Her book then goes on to explain in detail exactly how they did in fact manage to pull it off, a feat which she herself called surprising. And finally, my third example is related to this one. The thing is, even the most famous and highly regarded international economists don't always give the best advice. There have been times when the wisest thing Chinese policymakers have done is not listen to that advice. In the 1980s, as Chinese policymakers were debating amongst themselves what would be the best and safest way to move from a planned to a market economy, there were some world-leading economists from the United States and also from Europe who were advising them to put into practice a policy program called shock therapy. That really meant liberalize your pricing system rapidly all at once. That will get your market going. The book I mentioned earlier by Isabella Weber is on exactly this topic. It's called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. Weber shows that while there were several policymakers in China who did want to follow shock therapy, there were enough cautious voices as well in influential positions that in the end they decided not to take this advice. Instead, they stuck with dual track pricing, keeping some planned prices and just moving slowly bit by bit over to market prices. History now shows us that if they had listened to this shock therapy advice, they likely really would have crashed the economy, because that's exactly what happened in Russia at the start of the 1990s. Thank you for watching.